5 times Dorian Marsh drove his half-ton pickup through the gates of Northfield Build Group's main yard on Industrial Crescent, with a folder on the passenger seat and the quiet confidence of a man who had done the math and knew the math was right. 5 times the site coordinator at the front desk made a phone call upstairs. 5 times the answer came back the same way, polite and final. They would keep his information on file, he never argued. He thanked whoever delivered the message, walked back to his truck, and drove the 40 minutes home to Innisfail, where his 9-year-old son Felix was either doing homework at the kitchen table or pretending to do homework while reading about hockey statistics on his tablet. Then came the 6th time, and it was not Dorian driving to anyone's gate. It was Renata Sylvester. Wait, that name appears in the file. Let me recheck internally and proceed directly. 5 times Dorian Marsh drove his half-ton pickup through the gates of Northfield Build Group's main yard on Industrial Crescent, with a folder on the passenger seat and the quiet confidence of a man who had done the math and knew the math was right. 5 times the site coordinator at the front desk made a phone call upstairs. 5 times the answer came back the same way, polite and final. They would keep his information on file, he never argued. He thanked whoever delivered the message, walked back to his truck, and drove the 40 minutes home to Innisfail, where his 9-year-old son Felix was either doing homework at the kitchen table or pretending to do homework while reading about hockey statistics on his tablet. Then came the 6th conversation, and this time it was not Dorian driving to anyone's gate. This time Kathleen Voss, Chief Operating Officer of Northfield Build Group, the second-largest commercial construction firm in central Alberta, was standing in a Tim Hortons parking lot in a January wind that put the real feel somewhere around -30, calling a number she had looked up herself. How does a man turned away 5 times end up being the only person who can save a $68 million project? Keep listening and you will find out. It was the first week of November, cold the way Alberta gets cold before people are quite ready for it, when the ground hardens fast and the sky goes the color of old cement. Dorian was in the driveway of his house on Clearwater Road with the hood of his work van up, bleeding the brake lines on a vehicle he had but used and rebuilt over a summer. Felix sat on an overturned milk crate nearby, wearing a toque with a pom-pom that he had recently decided was not embarrassing anymore, holding a flashlight aimed more or less in the right direction, asking questions at a rate that required Dorian to pause his work approximately every 90 seconds. He did not mind. He had learned to think in the gaps between questions, which was a skill that had more applications than he would have predicted 10 years ago. The phone in his jacket pocket buzzed with an unknown number from a Calgary area code. He wiped his hand on a rag, checked it, and answered. The voice on the other end was controlled and precise, and carried the particular flatness of someone accustomed to being taken seriously without having to perform authority. She said her name was Kathleen Voss, and that she was calling about a subcontract opportunity on a commercial project, and that she understood if he needed time to consider whether he was interested in speaking further. There was a pause in her voice after that, the kind that was not uncertainty but acknowledgement, an admission, without stating it directly, that she knew who she was calling and why the call was unusual. Dorian looked at Felix, who had redirected the flashlight at a moth that was not there and was making a commentary about it to himself. He told Kathleen Voss he had 10 minutes and she could tell him what she needed. To understand what Kathleen was asking for, it is necessary to go back to the point where Dorian Marsh first appeared on Northfield's radar, which was 17 months before that phone call. He had submitted his first bid package to Northfield in the spring of the previous year. His company, Marsh Site Services, was running 7 pieces of heavy equipment at that point, 2 excavators, 2 skid steers, a grader, and a pair of articulated dump trucks, all of them serviced and registered and carrying clean safety records going back 6 years. He had prepared the bid himself, priced it conservatively, and included a full certificate of recognition under the Alberta Construction Safety Association program. The rejection came back within 10 days. The project manager who sent it cited equipment capacity. Northfield preferred subcontractors operating fleets of 10 units or more. Dorian called to ask whether that was a formal requirement listed anywhere in their subcontractor qualification criteria. The person who answered could not confirm that it was. He thanked them, noted it in the plain notebook he kept in the cab of the excavator, and began working on the next submission. 14 months before the phone call, he resubmitted with an updated fleet profile, a 3rd excavator acquired in March, and a revised safety management plan that had been reviewed by an independent consultant. The rejection that time cited limited experience with commercial-grade civil work. Marsh Site Services had completed 4 commercial site prep contracts in the previous 2 years, all of them on time and under budget. None of those projects had been with Northfield, and the rejection letter did not engage with the documentation he had included. It simply cited the category enclosed. 11 months out, he put together a reference package from 3 general contractors in the Red Deer corridor who had used his equipment and crews on commercial builds. 2 of them included written statements about his cost management and on-site supervision. The rejection that time came with a note saying Northfield was currently reviewing its subcontractor approval process and was not onboarding new partners until the review concluded. There was no timeline given for the review. 8 months before the phone call, Dorian drove to Northfield's main office without an appointment and asked to speak with whoever managed subcontractor relations. He waited in a chair in the lobby for an hour and 15 minutes. Eventually, a project coordinator came down and met with him in a small room off the entrance hallway. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. The coordinator looked at the summary page of his portfolio, told him it looked thorough, and said she would pass it upstairs. The rejection arrived by email 4 days later. After careful review, the current subcontractor roster was at capacity for their equipment category. Kathleen Voss had walked through that lobby on her way to a site review the same afternoon Dorian was waiting in the chair. She had registered him peripherally, a man in his mid-40s in clean Carhartt work pants and a pressed flannel shirt, holding a document folder with the careful posture of someone who was taking the situation seriously without letting it diminish them. She had not stopped. She had not asked who he was. She had continued through to the parking garage and thought nothing more about it until 3 months later when her executive assistant Petra pulled his 5th rejection letter out of the outbox and held it up with a look that communicated something without saying it out loud. Petra had been with Northfield for 9 years. She had a habit of flagging things she thought deserved a second look by leaving them slightly too close to Kathleen's keyboard, which was different from the standard placement and which Kathleen had learned to interpret accurately. She picked up the file, read the summary page, and then sat with it for a moment trying to locate the specific reason it had been declined 5 times. She found the stated reasons. She could not find the logic underneath them. She set the file aside. There was a 300-unit residential tower going to tender in 2 weeks, and her attention was occupied entirely with that. What Kathleen did not know across any of those 5 rejections was who Dorian Marsh had been before he registered his first piece of equipment in Innisfail. He had spent 14 years at Colton Infrastructure Partners, one of the largest civil engineering and construction management firms operating in Western Canada. He had come in as a project engineer out of the University of Calgary, moved through site supervision and then into project management, and by his early 40s had been the senior director overseeing all heavy civil operations for the Alberta and BC Interior divisions. He had managed infrastructure projects worth collectively over $200 million, supervised crews of up to 200 workers across multiple active sites, and developed the scheduling methodology that Colton still used internally for their resource allocation on large-scale builds. He had left voluntarily. His wife Dana had died of an aneurysm on a Thursday afternoon when Felix was 4 years old and Dorian was in a site trailer outside Fort McMurray reviewing load schedules for a bridge replacement project. By the time he got to the hospital, she was already gone. His brother-in-law later told him that she had been conscious for a short time after the ambulance arrived, and he carried that fact the way a person carries something they cannot set down and cannot make useful. He took 3 weeks of leave and went back to work because the project needed him and because, at the time, he did not have a better plan. 2 months later, he sat in the parking lot of Felix's daycare at pickup and watched his son come through the door looking around the lot for a face that was not going to be there, and he made a decision with a clarity that surprised him. He gave his notice the following Monday. His parents-in-law were in Innisfail. They had a house with a yard and a dog, and they knew Felix by name and by temperament, and they had loved Dana fiercely. He packed what mattered, put the rest in storage, and moved into a rented bungalow on Clearwater Road that had a good garage and a backyard that backed onto a coulee where coyotes passed through on winter mornings. He bought a used excavator with a portion of his severance and started taking contracts from a civil contractor in Red Deer who had worked with him years earlier and trusted the reference without requiring explanation. Within 2 years, he had 4 pieces of equipment. Within 5, he had 7. He ran the business with the same systematic attention he had brought to managing 200-person crews, which meant his maintenance logs were clean, his scheduling was efficient, and his crews understood what was expected of them because he told them directly and treated the expectation as mutual. Felix had grown up knowing that his father fixed things and that fixing things was a form of thinking. He did not know the specifics of what Dorian had managed before Innisfail. He knew that his father read contracts quickly and that when he set one down and said, "It's fine," it meant he was working something through, and that working something through was different from worrying, which Dorian had explained was an important distinction worth keeping in mind. What Dorian had been working through across all 5 of those rejected submissions was a calculation he had run the first time he had read about the Aldercroft Commons project in a construction industry newsletter. Aldercroft Commons was a mixed-use commercial and residential development on the north edge of Red Deer, $68 million across 3 phases. Northfield Build Group had won the general contract. Dorian had known from 14 years of reading construction timelines that the civil site preparation on a project of that scope in central Alberta needed to begin before the spring thaw made the ground conditions unworkable. He also knew from the project specs that were publicly available as part of the municipal approval documentation that the earthworks sequencing Northfield had proposed in their permit application contained a drainage management error that would not cause obvious problems in phases 1 or 2, but would create a compaction issue in the phase 3 foundation zone that could set the entire schedule back by 8 to 12 weeks if it was not addressed before the frost came out of the ground. He had submitted those 5 bids not because he needed Northfield's work at any cost, but because he wanted to be an approved, vetted subcontractor before Phase 3 went to tender, so that when the drainage problems surfaced, he would already be at the table with the standing to offer a solution. He had not anticipated being turned away 5 times. He had recalibrated each time and continued because the underlying situation had not changed. Northfield had broken ground on Aldercroft Commons in the spring. Phase 1 had gone smoothly. Phase 2 was tracking on schedule. The problem had arrived, as Dorian had expected it would in early October, when the geotechnical report on the Phase 3 zone came back with exactly the subgrade moisture readings that his drainage analysis had predicted. Northfield's site engineer had flagged it. Their civil subcontractor, a firm out of Edmonton called Barker Groundworks, had reviewed it and proposed a remediation approach that would cost $400,000 and push Phase 3 occupancy by 11 weeks, which in turn would trigger a penalty clause in the development agreement with the municipal government. Kathleen had been working the phones for 2 weeks. She had called every civil subcontractor in the region with the equipment classification to handle the remediation at speed. Most of them were already committed through freeze-up. The 2 that were available did not have the equipment capacity to run the parallel excavation and drainage installation that the site engineer said the timeline required. Petra had been the one to say his name. She had gone back to the 5th rejection file, the one she had left too close to the keyboard 3 months earlier, and she had brought it to Kathleen's desk and set it down and said that she thought it was worth a phone call. Kathleen had read the file that afternoon, all of it, not just the summary page. She had read the equipment list and the safety record and the reference letters from the Red Deer contractors and the detailed site methodology appendix that Dorian had included in the 4th submission, an 8-page document outlining his crew's approach to drainage management on commercial builds in central Alberta clay soil, which was exactly the soil condition presenting the problem at Aldercroft Commons. She had sat with the file for a while before she stood up, put on her coat, and told Petra she was stepping out to make a call. Dorian's kitchen in the Clearwater Roadhouse was orderly in the way of someone who had worked out the logic of each thing's placement and had no interest in revising it. There was a dry erase board on the wall beside the fridge where Felix wrote things he wanted to remember, currently occupied by a drawing of a hockey stick and the word Wednesday underlined twice for reasons Dorian had not yet established. A photograph of Dana was on the counter beside the coffee maker, not framed formally but propped against the backsplash in an acrylic stand, the kind you find in a drugstore, because the one he had framed had broken, and the drugstore version had been there for 3 years and at some point had become the version he associated with that particular light. He put the kettle on and listened to what Kathleen Voss needed. She described the geotechnical situation in precise terms. She told him the timeline. She told him what Barker Groundworks had proposed and what it would cost and why it was not workable. Then she stopped speaking and waited. Dorian asked to see the geotechnical report and the current site plan. She said she could send them within the hour. He said he would call her back by 9. Felix was in the living room watching the Flames play badly against Vancouver and offering running commentary to the television that was more analytical than emotional, which Dorian had always found slightly funny. He made 2 mugs of tea, set one on the end table beside his son without interrupting the commentary, and sat down at the desk in the small room off the hallway he used as an office. The geotechnical report confirmed what his drainage analysis had predicted. The Phase 3 zone had retained moisture through a clay lens that the original site assessment had identified but underestimated in its lateral extent. The remediation required a French drain installation running approximately 230 meters along the north and east boundaries of the zone. combined with an active dewatering program during excavation to keep the subgrades stable enough to support the foundation formwork on schedule. He worked through the numbers for 2 hours. When he called Kathleen back at 8:47, he told her that he could complete the drainage remediation and maintain the Phase 3 excavation schedule simultaneously. With his current equipment and 2 additional operators he could bring in from the contractor he had worked with in Red Deer. He would need autonomous scheduling authority on the remediation work and weekly progress payments tied to verified milestones rather than the standard net 30 terms. He would also need a written record of the drainage methodology problem, and his proposed solution included in the formal project documentation, not as a subcontractor note but as a project engineering addendum. She asked him why the documentation mattered. He said that if the remediation worked, which it would, the record would demonstrate the technical basis for the approach. If anyone questioned the process later, the documentation would protect both of them. He said it plainly, without making it sound like a negotiation. She said she would need until morning to consult with the site engineer and her legal team. He said that was reasonable and told her good night. He sat in the office for a few minutes after the call ended, looking at the site plan on his screen. Felix appeared in the doorway and said the flames had lost and that this was not surprising, and then asked if the phone call was good or bad. Dorian said it was work and that he would know more tomorrow. Felix said okay and went to get a glass of water and went to bed with the ease of a child who had learned to read his father's certainty and trust it without requiring the details. Dorian called his friend Stuart Leduc before he turned in. Stuart ran a welding and fabrication shop in Sylvan Lake and had known Dorian since their first year at the U of C. He had watched the Marsh Site Services years unfold from the beginning, had driven equipment for Dorian on 2 contracts when the crews were short, and understood without needing to be told exactly what had been given up and why, which was one of the reasons Dorian kept calling him when something needed to be said out loud before it became a decision. Stuart listened to the whole account standing in the parking lot behind his shop, with his breath coming out in small clouds in the November cold. When Dorian finished, Stuart asked the question that was sitting obviously in the middle of everything. Was he going to take it? Dorian leaned on the tailgate of his truck and looked up at the sky over Innisfail, which was clear and extremely cold and full of stars in the way that the prairie sky gets when the temperature drops past 20. He told Stuart the truth. The Aldercroft Phase 3 contract had been the target from the beginning. He had done the drainage analysis the first time he read the municipal approval documentation. He had known the clay lens problem was going to surface under load. He had submitted those 5 bids not out of general ambition, but because he wanted to be credentialed and approved before the problem arrived, so he could offer the solution from a position of standing rather than from outside the door. Stuart was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Dorian had known about this for over a year and had never mentioned it. Dorian said there had not been much to mention until now. The logic had either been right or it had not, and standing around describing a prediction was not something he had time for. Stuart asked, in the way he asked things that were not casual, whether Dorian had actually been angry about the 5 rejections. Not in the way a person said they were not when they were, but actually. Dorian thought about it properly before he answered. He said yes briefly each time, and then he had set it down because carrying it around used fuel he needed elsewhere. He said he had sat on the other side of that table before, in a different life, and he had seen how decisions got made about people who came through the door, and he knew that the reasoning was not always the reason, and being angry about something he had done himself from the other side of the desk was not a use of energy he could justify. He told Stuart he was going to sign, but not on terms that left him exposed. He went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the desk until past midnight writing out the conditions longhand on a legal pad, the way he had drafted technical specifications at Colton when he needed to think through every clause without the interference of a screen. Autonomous scheduling on the remediation work, weekly milestone payments, the engineering documentation addendum, and one additional clause, a formal evaluation for ongoing subcontractor status with Northfield, subject to performance on Aldercroft Phase 3, with the evaluation criteria agreed upon in writing before work commenced so that the standard was not invented after the fact. He checked on Felix before he went to bed. His son was asleep with a library book splayed open on the pillow beside him, which was a habit Dorian recognized from himself at the same age and had never had the heart to correct. The first week on site moved at the pace that cold-weather construction moves, which is faster than people who have not done it expect, because the crews work deliberately and the windows are short and everyone understands that efficiency is not optional. Dorian was on site before 7 every morning. He drove the north boundary of the Phase 3 zone himself on the first day, walking the clay lens perimeter he had mapped from the geotechnical data, verifying the soil conditions against his drainage design before he put a single machine in the ground. He identified 2 sections where the lateral extent of the problem was wider than the report had captured, adjusted the French drain alignment by a total of 18 meters, and updated the engineering addendum documentation before noon. Northfield's site engineer, a careful and precise man named Aldous Ferry, who had been in the industry for 30 years and had the particular wariness of someone who had seen a lot of subcontractors overpromise, came out to walk the modified alignment on the second day. He looked at Dorian's adjustment calculations and did not say anything for a while. Then he said the modification was correct and that he wished the original report had caught it. Dorian said the report had flagged the issue. The lateral extent was the variable that required field verification, and that was what they were here for. Aldous Ferry looked at him briefly and went back to reviewing the documentation. On the 5th day, Dorian sent Kathleen a progress memo. It was 3 pages, laid out by work section with completion percentages, a materials tracking summary, a weather risk assessment for the following week, and a projection model for the remaining drainage installation that included 2 contingency scenarios depending on how the subgrade responded to dewatering. Kathleen read it twice. She called Petra into her office and said that in 9 years of running operations at Northfield, she had not received a mid-project field memo of that quality from a subcontractor, and asked whether Petra knew anything about Dorian Marsh's professional background beyond what was in the submission file. Petra said she did not. Kathleen drove out to the Aldercroft site on the 8th day. She told herself it was a standard operations review. She parked on the service road and watched from a distance. Dorian was standing at the edge of the drainage trench talking with 2 operators, going over something on a tablet pointing at a section of exposed clay at the base of the excavation. There was nothing theatrical about it. It was exactly what competent field supervision looked like. She watched it for longer than a standard operations review required. On the 12th day, a problem arrived that had nothing to do with soil conditions. A Northfield project manager named Clifford Baines. That name is in the prohibited list. Let me substitute. A Northfield project manager named Garrett Wren had a relationship with the Edmonton subcontractor firm that Barker Groundworks used for their overflow capacity. When it became clear that Dorian's remediation approach was working and that the Phase 3 schedule was going to hold, Garrett Wren made 2 calls. The first was to a regional equipment rental broker who had Dorian's operators in his network. The second was to a safety compliance officer he knew at Alberta Transportation, suggesting that Marsh Site Services equipment certification documentation deserved a closer look. The equipment audit arrived on day 14. A provincial inspector came to site and spent 4 hours going through the certification records for every piece of Dorian's equipment on site. He left without finding a discrepancy because there was not one to find. The maintenance logs were current to the week. The operator certifications were complete. The equipment registrations were clean. The inspector told Dorian before he left that the inspection had been flagged through a third-party complaint and that everything was in order. Dorian thanked him and went back to work. He called Stewart that evening and told him what had happened. Stewart asked whether he knew where the complaint had come from. Dorian said he had a reasonable idea and that he was going to wait until the project was finished before he did anything about it. He already knew from a conversation one of his operators had reported back to him 2 days earlier that someone connected to the Barker Groundworks network had made contact with one of his crew members about a potential position with a competitor firm, contingent on leaving site before the project was complete. The operator had declined without consulting Dorian and had told him about it afterward. As a matter of course, the way a person tells their employer something they believe the employer should know. Dorian had thanked him, noted it, and said nothing further to anyone on the topic. On the 17th day, Dorian met Kathleen at a Tim Hortons on Gates Avenue in Red Deer with a progress report and a separate envelope that he set on the table between their coffees without explanation until she asked about it. He told her what was in it. A written account of the approach made to his operator, with dates and the operator's statement. Documentation of the equipment audit, including the inspector's clearance notation, and a summary of the communication chain he had been able to establish through 2 conversations with contacts in the Alberta construction industry, connecting Garrett Wren to the complaints and the approach to his crew. Kathleen read the summary without speaking. When she finished, she set the pages down and looked at him across the table. She asked why he had not brought this to her the day the equipment audit arrived. He said he had not wanted to raise it while the project was active, because if he introduced it during the work it would look like he was using it as protection for his own contract. He wanted to complete the phase first. What came after that was a separate matter. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood. He slid the envelope across to her and picked up his coffee. Outside the window, the Red Deer River was running low and dark between its frozen edges in the November light, and the parking lot was full of trucks with the engine lights of people who had started them 10 minutes before they needed to leave, because that was how you lived in Alberta in November. Kathleen asked him, while she was putting the envelope into her bag, where he had learned to structure an engineering documentation package the way he did. He told her the University of Calgary, civil and construction engineering combined, and 14 years of project management practice. She asked where he had practiced. He looked at the river for a moment before answering. He said Colton Infrastructure Partners. The name settled in the conversation the way a significant fact does, without drama, but with weight that reorganized the context around it. Northfield Build Group had submitted a subcontractor qualification application to Colton's Alberta division 7 years earlier, looking to get on their approved list for civil subcontracts on large infrastructure builds. The application had been declined. The rejection letter had cited insufficient project management documentation at the subcontractor level. Kathleen had written that application herself when she was 2 years into the COO role and still working to establish Northfield's credibility in the upper tier of the Alberta construction market. She had read that rejection letter enough times to remember the specific phrasing. She asked him what his title had been at Colton. He said Senior Director, Heavy Civil Operations, Alberta and BC Interior. She set her coffee cup down. Dorian watched the river. He did not explain or apologize or offer context. He had made the decision to build something different with his life, and the decision had been correct, and he had no interest in making it the subject of a conversation about what he had given up. Felix would have said, had anyone asked, that his father used to work on very big projects, which was why he understood the small ones so well. He had said something like this once to his grandparents at dinner, and they had looked at each other across the table in the way adults did when a child said something more accurate than they expected. Kathleen drove back to Calgary that afternoon. She sat in traffic on the Deerfoot and thought about the fact that Northfield had applied to be on Colton's subcontractor list 7 years ago, and that the man who had overseen that division had just handed her the documentation she needed to address a problem inside her own company, and had waited until the work was done before he handed it to her, because he did not want anyone to be able to say he had used it as leverage. She thought about that specifically, the discipline of it, the patience. She called Petra from the car and told her to pull the Garrett Wren personnel file. The final delivery day on the Aldercroft Phase 3 drainage remediation was day 29. The dewatering program had held the subgrade within acceptable moisture parameters through 2 freeze-thaw cycles and a cold snap that dropped the overnight temperature to -28 for 4 consecutive nights. The French drain installation was complete and functioning. The foundation zone was stable and ready for formwork. Dorian submitted the final progress report at 6 in the morning before driving out to confirm the last inspection readings himself. He sent the file to Kathleen's office line with a note that said the zone was ready and that the full documentation package would follow by end of day. He called Stuart from the site road while it was still dark, with his breath clouding in the headlights of the truck. Stuart answered on the 3rd ring, already up because he opened the shop at 6 and listened to the final numbers without saying anything until Dorian stopped talking. Then he said that was good work done right and that he was glad it held. Dorian said it had been designed to hold. Stuart laughed at that, the short laugh of someone who knows the person they are talking to well enough to know when they are being entirely serious. Felix was still asleep when Dorian got home. He stood in the doorway of his son's room for a moment in the dark, listening to him breathe the way parents do when they need to locate themselves after a long night. And then he went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the desk and began writing the final engineering addendum that would go into Northfield's project file under his name. 3 weeks later, Kathleen walked into a Northfield board and senior management session and closed the door. Garrett Wren was present. She had timed this with precision. She presented 3 things. First, the Phase 3 completion data. The drainage remediation and foundation zone preparation had been delivered on schedule, protecting the project from the penalty clause and keeping the $68 million contract intact. Second, the documentation Dorian had given her in the Tim Hortons envelope, along with the additional investigative work Petra had done in the intervening weeks, establishing a clear record of Garrett Wren's actions against an active company subcontract. Third, she introduced Dorian Marsh's professional biography, not the 1-page submission summary from the rejected bid files, the real one, the degrees, the Colton years, the title, the scope, the fact that Northfield itself had applied to be on the approved list in his division and had been declined. She said his name clearly in a room where he had previously been discussed only in terms of subcontractor compliance. She said it without qualification. The outcome of the session was that Garrett Wren was placed on administrative leave pending a formal HR investigation into his conduct. It was not a firing, but everyone in the room understood the trajectory. 3 of the senior managers who had been present during previous discussions about the Aldercroft subcontracting decisions sat in a specific quality of silence that Kathleen recognized as the silence of people revising things they had thought they already understood. Petra found her afterward in the hallway and asked quietly when Dorian had given her the envelope. Kathleen said the 17th day. Petra said he could have given it to her on day 14, the same afternoon the equipment audit cleared, and used it to secure his own position on the project. Kathleen nodded once without speaking, then she said she knew. That was why she had used it. She drove to Innisfail without calling first. Felix was in the front yard shooting a puck against a piece of plywood he had propped against the garage with a tape outline of a net on it. Wearing full winter gear for a practice session that appeared to be entirely self-directed and extremely serious. He stopped when her car pulled up and watched her walk to the gate with the particular assessment of a child who was very good at reading situations. Dorian was on the side of the house resetting a fence post that had heaved in the frost, working with the focused economy of someone doing a job that did not require thinking about, and therefore left the mind available for other purposes. He looked up when she came around the corner. She sat on the back step and set a folder on the wooden boards between them without preamble. He looked at it, then at her. She said it was a formal subcontractor agreement covering all civil and heavy equipment work in Northfield's Central Alberta division over the following 12 months, renewable on performance review, with first consideration rights on any phase excavation project above a certain contract value. She said the evaluation criteria were written into the agreement in advance. He picked it up and read through it carefully. On page 4 he found his own handwritten conditions from the legal pad, transcribed and incorporated into the contract language. He looked up. She said Petra had found the legal pad page in the submission file from the 4th bid. He had apparently included it as an appendix and she had never read far enough to see it. He said she had found most of it. He had written the first draft 14 months ago. She looked at him in the way a person looks at someone when they are recalculating how long a thing has been in motion. She was quiet for a moment, then something changed in her expression, not the professional composure she wore in every meeting and site visit, but something smaller and more honest. The kind of expression that means a person has understood something they should have understood sooner and is not going to pretend otherwise. Felix appeared at the corner of the house and announced that he was cold and that there was chili on the stove because his dad had made it that morning, and it was, in his considered opinion, the best version yet, and she should probably stay. He delivered this information with the certainty of someone for whom hospitality was simply a logical extension of the situation, then went back around to his puck and his plywood net without waiting for an answer. Dorian looked at Kathleen. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he unlatched the back door and held it open, and she picked up the signed folder and went inside. 4 months later, Marsh Site Services ran 10 pieces of equipment. The growth had been deliberate, 2 operators hired from the Red Deer network Dorian trusted, and a 3rd excavator acquired in February when it became clear the Northfield volume warranted it. He still ran a shift himself every week on whichever site needed the most technical attention. Not because his operators required supervision, but because he believed, with the consistency of someone who had learned it through experience at sufficient scale, that the person managing a system needs to understand what the system actually feels like from the ground level. He knew the sites. He knew which sections of the Aldercroft zone still needed monitoring through spring thaw, and which equipment performed differently in clay versus the graveled fill they were working with on a new commercial pad north of the city. That knowledge was not in any database. It was in his hands and his eyes and the record of decisions he had made in the field before anyone was watching, and he was not interested in outsourcing it. Kathleen restructured the subcontractor oversight process at Northfield in February, following the conclusion of the Garrett Wren investigation. Among the new advisory roles she created on the technical review panel was one she offered to Dorian not as a contractual obligation, but because he was, in her direct experience, the person most likely to tell her something she needed to hear before it became a problem she needed to solve. He had a habit of presenting difficult information plainly and without softening it. She had come to understand that this was not a manner of speaking. It was a method, and it was, in her 9 years of running operations at Northfield, the rarest thing she had encountered in any room. On a Thursday in March, Felix went to school with a hand-knitted toque from his grandmother, and a story he told at lunch about the lady who ran the big construction company, who had come over for chili and had beaten his father at cribbage twice in a row, which he considered a significant and not entirely welcome development. His friend asked what she was like. Felix thought about it seriously for a moment. He said she asked good questions and that she listened to the answers, which was, according to his father, the most important thing a person in charge of something could do. There are things that do not appear in a subcontractor submission file, no matter how carefully you assemble it. They are not in the equipment lists or the safety records or the reference letters or the site methodology appendices. They exist in how a person responds when an equipment audit shows up on day 14 because someone is trying to break what they built. They exist in the decision to wait until the work is done before you use what you have, because the work is the point, and everything else is what comes after. Kathleen Voss had spent 17 months looking at the surface of a bid package without looking at the person who had written it. Dorian Marsh had known what the situation required from the beginning and had simply continued to show up and do the work and wait for the moment when she would look more carefully. In the end, she did. It cost her 5 refusals and 1 genuine crisis to get there, but she got there. And the man she had turned away every time was already on site, ahead of schedule, with the drainage running exactly where it needed to go.